Turn in your Bible to Daniel chapter 7. I was getting the sense that everybody was excited to get into the prophecy portion of the book. Last week I had several people come up and say, you know, how they like going through the miracles, but boy, they can't wait to get to the last part of the book because of all the prophecy and things going on. And I won't say surprises me, but it's interesting to me how people are super interested in prophecy and things to come. And Daniel does have some of that in it for sure. But Daniel chapter 7, this is the vision of the four beasts. Daniel chapter 6, as you remember last week, concluded the historical or the miracles section of the book, if you can call it that, right? Daniel chapter 7 through the end of the book is devoted to prophecy. So from here on out, we can mentally switch gears and focus on a different subject of inspired truth, right? And you know, when I put ... right, you know there's probably more to the discussion. Right? I'm not quite so sure about mentally switching gears here just yet. And let me show you what I mean. For three reasons. One, you remember at the beginning of this book, we talked about how God divided the book into three sections himself by the languages it was written in. Chapter 1 up through chapter 2, verse 4, the first part of it was written in Hebrew, which tells me it was specifically targeted mainly towards the Jewish people, right? Because they were the Hebrew speakers. Then, chapter 2, verse 4, clear through the end of chapter 7 was in Aramaic, which was the general, everybody speaks this language. And then, beginning in chapter 8 through the end of the book, is back to Hebrew, specifically targeted to the Jews again. You notice that center section, what chapter is included at the tail end of that section? What is it? It's still in Aramaic. So that tells me maybe we're not to separate out from chapter 6 and chapter 7. Maybe those are still kind of to be lumped together in the same group. Reason number 2, you remember last week we said, when we were covering Daniel and the Lion's Den, we said, you know, there's kind of a lot of similarity here between chapter 6, the Lion's Den, and chapter 3, which was the fiery furnace. And we went through the similarities. We won't go through that again. Kind of a parallel almost. It's kind of the same story retold with different details. Interestingly enough, remember what we'll call the miracles section weren't all miracles as well. As we go through today's chapter, you might notice a lot of parallel between chapter 2 and chapter 7. So it's not really as unique as we might think. It's not like the previous section was all miracles, now we're getting into all prophecy. Chapter 2 is prophecy as well, right? Nebuchadnezzar laying in his bed. He has a vision of the statue, the gold head and the silver chest and arms and on down. And Daniel comes in and he interprets the dream and he says, oh, this is what is to come. These are the different kingdoms that will take over the world and rule and reign. So really that was prophecy as well. And we see a lot of similarities here in chapter 7, where you have the four different beasts, the four kingdoms that are to come, and they the successive kingdoms, and one rules and then another takes its place. There are differences between chapter 2 and chapter 7 as well, and we'll certainly look at those later on. But there are a lot of similarities, which again tells me maybe we're not to put chapter 7 in a separate section in our minds. Maybe it's to be included. But I think, to me, the biggest reason that I would include chapter 7 with the previous section of the book is this. You remember what the overall theme of each chapter has been so far throughout Daniel. Think about it for a second, in case your mind is rusty. Have it in mind. Chapter 2, we see these verses in verses 20 and 21. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. And he goes on. This is Nebuchadnezzar's proclamation after Daniel interprets his dream. Chapter 3. No other God is able to rescue in this way, declares Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon. No other God can do what he has done. Chapter 4. Twice in that chapter, in verses 3 and again in verse 34. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. Again, Nebuchadnezzar. Then we get to chapter 6 last week, verse 26. He is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. every single chapter, and I said this is the climax of each story, of each chapter. It's what? The proclamation, in most of these cases, by the ruler of the land, whether Nebuchadnezzar or Darius or whoever it was. Proclamation to the people, and here is my proclamation. It is what? The God of Daniel, or the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or the God of the Jews. He is the real God. He is the one who's calling the shots. He brings people up. He puts people down. He makes all the decisions. His dominion will be forever. He will rule and he will reign. He is the one in charge. He is the one to be worshipped. He is the one to be recognized as the true God. Remember, every chapter had that. And I said, this is the common theme, and this is what we're supposed to see as we go throughout each chapter of the book of Daniel. And as we get to chapter 7, look what else we see. Chapter 7, verses 14, and again in verse 27, twice. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. And again, coupling that with all the other chapters that we've just looked at, tells me that whatever goes in chapter 7, this is going to be the culmination. This is the point of the story once again, just like it has been with all the other miracles and with the statue and everything else we've seen earlier. So in my view, in my opinion, I definitely think that chapter 7 does not start a new section of the book of Daniel. It absolutely ends the previous section until we pick back up the Hebrew portion of it again. So, with that in mind, let's continue as we begin to read the first part of Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, and I really enjoy when he puts in little timestamps, by the way. He starts a new section. Chapter 6 happened under King Darius after the Medes and the Persians had taken over the Babylonian Empire. Now he's having a vision, and he actually kind of chronologically rewinds a little bit. So this happened several years early, 7 or 8 or whatever years earlier. The first year of Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar had died. We'd had several little kings in the middle. Belshazzar and Nabonidus take over. But in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, and it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped whatever was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And he's laying there, and he sees 4 successive beasts coming up out of the sea, out of the water. And the water is stirred up and troubled, and there's waves and wind and stuff going on. And up out of the water comes these 4 different beasts, all kind of scary, but especially the last one is super extra scary. And he continues on, verse 9, And I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So these beasts come up out of the water, and we're going to go back through them in just a minute, so don't worry, we're not skipping over it. But we get down to verse 9 and 10, and we see a different scene altogether. His vision shifts from the sea and the beasts, these animals that are here, and he looks up towards throne. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. And of course, we believe that to be God, the Father, the judge. And verses 9 and 10 are the courtroom scene where the judge walks into the courtroom and he takes his seat at the bench. And everybody is, all rise, and everybody rises and pays their respect. Only here they kind of bow down, probably. And the courtroom is in session. The Ancient of Days took his seat. Majesty and power and authority here. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool, fiery flames, wheels of burning fire. Just an awesome, powerful vision. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him, probably talking about the judgments that he issues. 1,000,000 served him, 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the court sat in judgment, and the books were opened, and the trial is about to begin. Then I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn that we read about earlier on was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed. That would be the fourth one. And its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, that would be the first three, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days. So if the Ancient of Days is God the Father, who is the Son of Man? If you know your Bible at all, this is a pretty common term for the Messiah, the ruler, Jesus, right? He is coming as well, and he comes in the clouds of heaven, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion was an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed, in contrast to the other kingdoms that we already saw. So a lot going on. We have the kingdom, or the beast coming and going, rising up out of the sea. We have a courtroom scene. We have the king, the everlasting king, being presented before the judge. And the judge says, you get dominion and rule over the earth, and you will rule forever. What does all this mean? Well, verse 15. Let's continue just a little bit more here. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. So here he starts to ask about what the visions mean. He receives all these visions. What do they mean? What's going on? What am I supposed to understand? And so he asks somebody standing there, presumably an angel probably, attending. And he says, hey, tell me what all this means. I don't understand. And he said, these things are four kingdoms which are to come. So now that we're starting to interpret, let's rewind a little bit and go back to the vision, the first 8 verses of the chapter. Daniel says, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Elsewhere in the Bible, the great sea, specifically in Revelation, chapter 13 and 17 correlate really well to this, by the way. We're not going to read through it this morning, but if you want to read through it on your own, that's fine. But it talks a lot about the same type of thing. But the sea, the multitudes, the nations, the mass multitude of people throughout the earth. The great winds were stirring up the sea, turbulence, trouble, turmoil, storms coming along, lots of unrest coming up throughout the nations. Verse 3, and four great beasts come out of the sea, one different from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then I looked as its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. The mind of a man was given to it. Remember we said earlier on, there's the last passage we read. We said earlier on that there's a lot of comparison between Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. You'll notice both of them have 4 kings coming one after the other, or 4 kingdoms, 4 dominions coming one after the other. And that's the same in Daniel 7 as in Daniel 2. So the first one to come up, we see, is Babylon, the first beast, right? And try to figure this out. The first was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. Lion is royal, it's stately, it's majestic, it's powerful, it has authority and rule, right? The king of the jungle, we even call it today. But then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. What could that have to do with what Babylon would have experienced, or specifically the ruler of Babylon might have experienced? Well, remember one of the stories we went through here in Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar meets God face to face, and Nebuchadnezzar's standing on the wall of the city, and he says, "Look at Babylon the Great, which I've created. Everything I've done here is for my splendor and my majesty and my glory and by my strength." And God comes down to him and says what? He says, "I don't think so. I'm going to have to teach you a lesson now, and you're going to crawl around on the ground and eat grass and be like an ox." And sure enough, immediately it happened, and Nebuchadnezzar's crawling around on his hands and knees and chewing on grass and mooing, and his hair is growing out and his fingernails are getting long, and he's just an ugly scene all the way around. So let's read this again. His wings were pulled off, all of his ability, his flight, his strength, his ability to maneuver, everything is taken away, and he was lifted, but then he was lifted up from the ground, taken from his humiliating situation, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. Where before he was the majestic lion, he had a lot of strength and a lot of authority and a lot of prowess, but he was still thinking like a beast, if you can say it that way. But afterwards, he has a whole new mindset when he comes back, doesn't he? What was his new mindset? Aha, I think now I know who's really in charge. Now I have a little bit better perspective, a little bit more insight on the reality of life, where God is in charge. He is the one calling the shots. I'm here because he put me here, and he has put me here to do certain things. But he's the one that calls the shots and makes the decisions. He's the one who really rules. So this lion, his wings were pulled off, but then afterwards he was lifted up from the ground, and the mind of a man was given to him. So he had a much better perspective afterwards. Prophecy fit pretty well? I would say so. Now, we call this part prophecy. In reality, in the first year of Belshazzar, this had already happened for Daniel, so this was kind of in the past for him. Then we get to the next verse, verse 5. "Behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, 'Arise and devour much flesh.'" This would have been future to Daniel. Not too much future, a few years in the future, talking about the Medes and the Persians when they would take over the Babylonian Empire. It says the bear was raised up on one side. Commentators seem to suggest that that's probably reflective of the imbalance of power between the Medes and the Persians. Again, I'm no historian. Correct me later if I'm wrong. But the Medes and the Persians kind of came together. The Medes were kind of the military might to start out with, and the Persians were kind of the administrators, and they teamed together. And so the Medes were stronger, but they didn't have the authority, and then later on in the kingdom it kind of switched around. But the power was always kind of imbalanced a little bit. And so the bear, he's strong and he's powerful and he can kill stuff and all that, but he is raised up on one side more than the other, a little bit of an imbalance of power. He has 3 ribs in its mouth. Again, commentators tell me that probably refers to the 3 major conquests that the empire took over. That would be Lydia, Egypt, and Babylon, the 3 major sectors of the kingdom that they would combine to form their kingdom. And he was told, "Devour much flesh." What does that mean? Again, probably referring just to the sheer amount and the number of people and cultures they took over. I found this interesting comparative map, a picture or a map of the Babylonian Empire. You see up there in pink, that sliver in the middle covers Babylon and some other regions, and it kind of curlicues down there to encompass Jerusalem as well, which is why they were exiled to Babylon. God used that to punish the people. And then the Babylonian Empire falls, and the Medes and the Persians take over. And here's a picture of the Medo-Persian Empire that came next. You can tell, size-wise, there's absolutely no comparison. The Medo-Persian Empire takes over way more land, way more peoples, way more cultures than the Babylonian Empire ever did. And so it makes sense here why God would say to the bear, rise up, stand up, devour lots of flesh. I'm going to give you a lot of dominion, a lot of military success as you combine your empire and make it huge. And sure enough, they did. That's exactly what happened. The next one, verse, where am I at? 6. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Again, this would refer to Greece, which took over the Medo-Persian Empire. They tell me the leopard, symbolic of speed, not only ferociousness, but also speed and quickness and agility. And what would be even quicker than a normal leopard, which is already pretty quick and agile? Probably the leopard with wings on its back to fly even faster, right? And this one has 4 wings. Well, the Greek Empire, headed by Alexander the Great, he had 4 generals that fought for him really well, gave him a lot of military success. I'm sure because he had 4 of them and they could subdivide and go their different ways, conquer a lot of things very quickly. Probably gave him the super speed that he had in conquering his area. So he had 4 good generals that allowed him to do what he did very quickly. But after Alexander's death, and we'll get to this in just a second, but those 4 generals kind of assumed his reign and broke up his empire into 4 pieces. Now those which had been 4 wings, which gave the empire its success and its speed and its ability, now did what? They're no longer wings, now they are the four heads of the empire, right? And they are trying to rule and reign, and long story short, they kind of break up the empire and they fight back and forth, and we'll get into that later on in the book anyway. But the 4 wings and the 4 heads talk about the 4 generals there, in my opinion. Again, just a fun little comparative map. Here's the Medo-Persian Empire, which I just showed you, and also then we have the Greek Empire in green beside it. You notice they're pretty much the same, a little here and a little there, plus or minus, in different areas, but pretty much they're the same. So Alexander goes through and he takes over much of what was the Medo-Persian Empire, which is a pretty huge area. I mean, it's a lot of area. The amazing thing is how quickly he did it. Alexander came to power when he was 20 years old, and he died at the age of 32, from what I've read. That gives him 12 short years to accomplish all of that, which is extraordinarily fast, very fast. And again, he died young, he had no kids, he never named a successor to his empire. And because there was no successor, there was a power vacuum. The military might, the generals stepped up, they kind of fought over the different parts of the empire, they ended up kind of fighting against each other, and everything just kind of fell apart. But again, we can see this prophecy coming true. Super speed for Alexander, and he took over much of what the Medes and the Persians had taken over previously. Finally, we get to verses 7 and 8. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, and it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Again, Rome, which took over after the Greeks, it was known for brutality and military strength. It would march in and just wipe people out. You remember what it did to Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem was kind of a rebellious, insolent little city anyway to the empire, because they were always staging this rebellion, that rebellion. But they caused a lot of damage to Jerusalem and to the rest of the empire. They were known for their military brutality and just their brute strength, and that's how they conquered. And so this beast, which is huge and scary, iron teeth, and later on it talks about the claws of brass as it comes in and just starts to take over and dominate and capture all the area that it goes after. And that's what that talks about. We get to verse 8, well, the last part of verse 7, though. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns. And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn the eyes were like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. What does this correlate to? We've gone through all the beasts and everything so far. We've figured out exactly what correlates to what pretty well, we think. It lines up really well. This part doesn't seem to line up in anything with history that we know of. In no time in Roman history were there 10 concurrent kings going on, according to what I've read. Again, I'm no historian. But we can't really find where this lines up with anything real well in history. And the little horn that comes up after the 10 kings are established and co-ruling. And this little horn, kings, right? If you haven't figured that out, the horns are kings or authoritative figures. Comes up after the 10 are already in existence. And he knocks out 3 of the existing kings and kind of takes the place and continues to grow until he's kind of the leader of them all. Nothing historically really lines up real well with that, which tells me maybe that part hasn't, what? Happened yet. Yeah. And we'll get to that again a little bit more towards the end of the book. After all these things and all these beasts and kingdoms have had their fun, they've had their day in the sun, then we get to verses 9 and 10. We've already read through them, but after all these things happen, the judge, the ultimate judge, the one who all the emperors before have said, yes, he is in charge, his dominion reigns forever, he's calling the shots, he's the sovereign. That judge takes the seat in the courtroom. And he sits down in his glory and majesty and power, and everybody's before him waiting to see what will happen. And he takes his place at the bench, and verse 10 says, the court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Who do you think we're judging at this point, in this context? Everything that has happened in the first half of the chapter, right? All the kingdoms, all the authorities which had previously been. But Daniel looks back. He says, I looked then because of the sounds of the great words that the horn was speaking. That'd be the little guy that we just read about back in verse 8. And I looked, and the beast was killed, and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. Complete decimation, total desecration, gone, kaput, no more, finite, it's over. Again, think back to chapter 2. What does this sound familiar to? What can we correlate that to? Remember the statue is standing there. We get the head and the chest and the legs and all that and the feet and everything. And then what happens? A rock that was not cut out by human hands comes flying or rolling or speeding or whatever towards the statue, and it strikes the statue on the feet, but the whole thing is destroyed. I don't know, like bottom to top or whatever. I almost picture it like just crumbling down to dust, all the way up, like a great big domino statue or something being destroyed from the bottom, and they just kind of crumble and fall and turn into dust and blow away. And that's how chapter 2 describes it. Same kind of thing going on here. The beast was killed, its body was destroyed to be burned with fire. But verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was, and again was, that would be past tense, not necessarily concurrently, was or had been taken away, but their lives were or had been prolonged for a season and a time. So the first beast comes along, the first kingdom, and is taken over by the next beast. But pieces of it are still maintained, and you can see the influence of Babylon over in the Medes and the Persians, right? Even the Babylon, the city, wasn't destroyed. They utilized it for their empire, and some of the philosophies and techniques from Babylon would have been carried over. And the people and the administration that were in Babylonian Empire carried over to the next empire. And the same with Alexander the Great, right? He incorporated some of the ideas and concepts and structures from the previous empires and incorporated them into his own to make it better. And the same with Rome. But when Rome is destroyed by this rock not cut out by human hands or by the Ancient of Days, he comes, and what does he do? He does not incorporate anything from the previously known world into his empire. When God reigns, when the Son of Man comes and sets up his dominion, he's not going to say, let's see, how did Rome do it? Or I like how Babylon did this. I think I'm going to bring that into my empire. He doesn't look to any of the previous human empires and say, let me incorporate, let me bring some of that into my kingdom. He says, I am going to reign and rule and reign in justice and righteousness and according to my character, not according to how you guys did it. This is my kingdom. Your guys' time is done, it's gone, but it is dust, it's blown away. And I will rule and I will reign in a perfect kingdom which will never go away, but I'm not going to look to you guys for guidance. I am the guidance, he says. I will set up my own kingdom. So the other beasts, their dominion is taken away. They fell, but their influence still lived on for a while. But when the last kingdom is destroyed, it's done. It's over. It's burned up. It's charred to a crisp. It's ashes. It's blown away. It's washed down the drain, and it's in the sewer floating down a pipe somewhere. And that's the end of it. Then the Son of Man is given his dominion. He is the ultimate king. Verse 14, to him was dominion was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And there's, again, I think the pinnacle and the apex of the story. All the other kingdoms that man has set up and everything they tried to accomplish set up. But it comes to pinnacle when the Son of Man comes to rule and reign forever. Really, this is about where chapter 2 ends, isn't it? And that's where in Nebuchadnezzar's dream he wakes up and says, I got to have somebody interpret this for me. Chapter 7, however, goes a little bit further. He continues in verse 19. After he gets the summary interpretation in verses 15 to 18, he continues because he's curious about that last beast. And he said, Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before of which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Ancient of Days came, the judgment was given. That's what we just read about back in verse 10, right? So he's catching up. He says, I was looking at this beast, and he redescribes him again. Very strong, very vicious, very brutal. And he talks about the horns again, the 10 concurrent reigning individuals, the authoritative powers concurrently reigning. Another power that comes up later and knocks out 3 of them and takes their place and continues to rule and reign. And this last one, he's arrogant, he's boastful, apparently a very brilliant and capable person who's good at deception, he's good at ruling, he's good at manipulating, he's very good at what he does, and he speaks boastful things about the Ancient of Days and against God himself. Spoke great things, seemed greater than his companions. He overshadows them. And the horn made war with the saints, and he prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came. Again, without diving specifically into Revelation and correlating a bunch of things, I think we can pretty much recognize this as who would be the last enemy to be defeated by the Messiah, and that would be the Antichrist at the end of the time, right? And if we are correct and our understanding is correct, and these horns, which take place on the last empire, they rise up. This is in the future yet, and that last ruler of the beast that happens of what people like to call the revived Roman Empire. I've heard it called that. Now, I've always been a little bit squinty on that one, and let me just explain. Initially, this beast would have been the Roman Empire, because that's what followed Greece, and that was the next world ruler. Then we see it has gone away for a while, and then we suppose that it will come back because these things haven't yet happened yet. In fact, again, Revelation 17 talks about this empire as being the one that was, that is not, and will be again. So there, again, that fits very well. It existed for a while, and then it goes away for a while. We're in that away period right now, and then supposedly it comes back again. Now, when it comes back again, will it take place again in Rome? Will it be a literal revived Roman Empire? What do you think? I know people online, sorry, I like a little give and take. So nobody that's actually here has to say anything out loud, but let's do a head shake. Well, in Rome or no, not in Rome? Everybody's going. So again, online, sorry you can't be here to see all the faces. It's really amusing. It cheers me up to see that. I'm not sure, and the reason I say that is that every time the Bible describes his empires, it doesn't talk about geography, does it? It talks about what? Characteristics. Characteristics of the empire. So this empire, this last one, will be revived. Will it geographically happen in Rome? Maybe. Maybe not, but maybe it'll be another empire, but it has the same characteristics as the first one. I know some of you are probably squirming in your seats pretty solidly right now because you're convinced it'll be from Rome. That's fine. I won't disagree. I just also won't necessarily agree because I don't know. But at the very least, it will have the same characteristics as that fourth beast will. And it'll come back with a vengeance. And somehow or other, and again, it scares me a little bit when people give more detail than what God gives us, right? If some of you are old enough, when they started using barcodes in the grocery store, right? And the barcodes come around, and that's the mark of the beast. Because, boy, if you line up these bars just in the right order, and there's 6 bars and 6 bars and 6 bars, and that's 666, and that's the mark of the Antichrist. And this is the last days, we're done, and tribulation might as well just be here. Well, that wasn't the case, right? I remember when Mikhail Gorbachev was ruling in the USSR, and he had the birthmark on his forehead. Well, that's got to be the mark of the beast, because it talks about the beast whose head was wounded and came back to life. And look, he's got a birthmark on his forehead, and now he's the Antichrist. Well, it wasn't. So it's easy to plug things in prematurely. So I hope it's not too much of a disappointment for you if I shy away from that, because I don't want to humiliate myself on YouTube forever and ever. So I will say, oftentimes, if our understanding is correct, and possibly and may be, right? And I'll try to shy away from specific assignments like that. But for however it works out, this final kingdom, divided by 10 rulers, that would be 4, 10 rulers, divided by 10 rulers, and after they're established and they're ruling and doing their thing, another one comes up and knocks out 3 of them and starts to take preeminence over the others. Continuing in verse 23, we got to start flying here. Thus he said, that would be the angel that Daniel's talking to, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and law, and they shall be given into his hand for time, times, and half a time. And we start to focus on this last little ruler, the one who raises up, who speaks horrible things against the Most High, the Ancient of Days, and the Son of Man. He almost tries to take his place. Look, I can be this guy. I can be this ruler. And again, from Revelation, he's the guy we would call the Antichrist, who receives his power from Satan himself, the ultimate counterfeiter. And he disposes 3 of the other kings so he can become more powerful. Look at the arrogance. He shall think to change the times and the law. And I don't know what all that includes. Schedules, time clocks, laws, but whatever it says, he says, my way is the best way. We're going to throw out what you guys did. I can do it my way, and I can do it better than God's way, and I will be the ultimate ruler of the world. And they shall be given into his hand, the saints presumably, for a time, times, and half a time. 1 plus 2 plus a half is 3.5, right? 3.5, which again, times we believe to be years. That's how we've seen it applied earlier in Daniel. That's how we see it applied in Revelation, so 3.5 years. And if you are familiar with Daniel at all, this will be very familiar to you and sound kind of familiar, where the time of the tribulation is 7 years, but it's divided in halves, and each half is 3.5 years. Yeah, you got it. Verse 28, but the court, from verse 10, shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, and to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And when the court sits in judgment, the judgment is not kind to this last little horn. And the Ancient of Days looks at him and says, you are guilty, you are out. It's judgment time for you. And he throws him out, and he's destroyed, wiped away, ground to dust, and he's gone forever and ever. And then we get back to verse 27. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. And his kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. And in this one last passage of Aramaic, before he switches back to Hebrew, he makes this one final massive proclamation to the entire empire, which he says, don't forget, one last time, God is the God who rules and reigns. He's the sovereign. He's in charge. He's the one that calls the shots. And no matter what other kingdoms come and go, and no matter what people do or set up or try to accomplish, at the end of the day, he's going to be the one in charge, and he will wipe out all the beasts that you have created. And he will set up his own rule and reign because he is the sovereign. And verse 28 ends the chapter, and I kind of wish they'd have put the first sentence here in the end of verse 27. I think it fits better. Here is the end of the matter. And again, I think personally probably that was the angel finishing his statement before Daniel adds his statement, right? So the angel gets done with his explanation in verse 27, and he says, all right, that is the end of the matter. And it is. When he sets up his rule and reign, and he is sovereign, that is the end of the matter. There will be no other kingdoms. His will reign forever. As for me, Daniel said, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. And that's how he ends the chapter. And that's how I have to end this morning, too, or else I'm going to be overtime again. But that's how he ends, with one last proclamation. He is the sovereign ruler. He is the one in charge. And his kingdom will never, ever pass away. And whether you call the previous kingdoms a glorious statue and a tribute to man's accomplishment, like Nebuchadnezzar saw in chapter 2, or if you call them nasty, gnarly, ugly, rambunctious, out-of-control beasts, like God sees them in chapter 7, either way they're going to be wiped out at the end of time when God sets up his rule and reign, because he's the sovereign, and he's the one who's in charge. Let's pray. God, we thank you this morning. We can again look at your plan for human history. You've got it all mapped out. You know the details. You know what will happen. You know how each kingdom behaves. You know how they fall. And you also know how you will take them over. You will conquer them all at the end of time when you set up your reign. We thank you that you're in charge, that you don't miss a thing, and you've got it all under control. How comforting that is for us today to look forward to. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.